betrayed by her toxic family. She vowed revenge with the help of her mountain man husband. It began in a quiet frontier church, with a woman standing alone as her own blood turned the town against her. They called her unstable. They took her home, her name, her future, right there in front of God and neighbors alike. By nightfall, she was fleeing into the mountains with nothing but a Bible, a hidden ledger, and a broken heart. That's when she crossed paths with a towering mountain man who believed strength was meant for mercy, not violence. Together they vanished from the world that betrayed her. But the past didn't stay buried. Years later, when land, water, and innocent lives were at stake, she returned, unrecognized, unbowed, and armed with the truth. Courtrooms replaced gunfights, records replaced revenge, and the family that tried to erase her faced a reckoning they never saw coming. When justice moves slow but sure, who truly wins? And what happens when quiet truth finally stands up to loud lies? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more dawn-painted golden streaks across Natalia Hawthorne's bedroom window as she stood before her mother's cherished mahogany mirror. Her fingers traced the soft wool of the faded blue shawl, her mother's favorite, draping it carefully around her shoulders. The familiar weight brought comfort, like her mother's embrace from years past. The ledger books waited on her desk, their leather covers worn smooth from daily use. Natalia settled into her chair, drawing one closer. The neat columns of numbers marched down the pages in her precise handwriting. Everything balanced perfectly, just as her mother had taught her. Each entry told its story. Feed purchased for Widow Johnson's chickens, credited against her egg deliveries. Thomas Miller's weekly flour order, paid in fence repairs. The numbers don't lie, her mother used to say. They tell the truth of a person's word. Natalia allowed herself a small smile, remembering those lessons at her mother's knee. The morning light strengthened as she worked, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Finally satisfied, she closed the ledger with a gentle thump. Time for church. Her boots clicked softly on the wooden stairs as she descended, each step measured and dignified despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. These Sunday gatherings had grown tenser since her father's remarriage to Margaret, but Natalia refused to let that keep her from worship. The dirt road into town stretched before her, already warming in the morning sun. Her shawl caught the breeze as she walked, the familiar path offering time to gather her thoughts. A few early risers nodded greeting as they passed, though some gazes slid away too quickly. Natalia squared her shoulders. The Lord gave strength for all trials, she reminded herself. The white-painted church stood, proud against the blue sky, its simple bell tower reaching heavenward. Already, wagons and buggies clustered in the yard, Sunday-best dresses and polished boots making their way up the steps. Natalia paused at the bottom, drawing a steadying breath. The service began as always, familiar hymns rising to the rafters, children fidgeting in their seats, Reverend Miles's earnest voice leading prayer. Natalia let the rhythm of worship ease her spirit, even managing a genuine smile at Mrs. Peterson's enthusiastic off-key singing. The peace shattered halfway through the sermon. The heavy church doors burst open with a bang that made half the congregation jump. Edgar Hawthorne strode down the center aisle, his wife Margaret gliding at his elbow like a dark shadow. Their footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. "Reverend Miles," Edgar's voice carried to every corner, "I apologize for the interruption, but this cannot wait. It concerns my daughter's welfare." Natalia's hands clenched in her lap, the soft wool of her mother's shawl suddenly suffocating. She could feel every eye in the church turning toward her. Reverend Miles stood uncertainly at his pulpit. "Perhaps, Mr. Hawthorne, we could discuss this after—" "No." Margaret's cultured voice cut through his protest. "This affects the whole community. They should hear the truth." Edgar cleared his throat. "My daughter Natalia has been unwell, making concerning decisions about our family business, decisions that put everything we've built at risk." "That's not true!" The words burst from Natalia before she could stop them. Her voice sounded thin in the vast space. "You see?" Margaret's tone dripped with concern. "She grows emotional so quickly now. We've all noticed the changes in her behavior." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Natalia saw Mrs. Peterson draw her children closer, saw Thomas Miller study his boots, saw Widow Johnson's face crease with worry. "Reverend Miles," Edgar's voice hardened. "As her father, I must act to protect both Natalia and our business interests. I have the documents here." "Please." Natalia stood, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Reverend Miles, I assure you I am perfectly sound of mind. The ledgers will show the very fact that you would make such a scene in church." Margaret shook her head sadly. Reverend Miles shifted his weight, eyes darting between father and daughter. His shoulders slumped. Perhaps it would be best to continue this discussion outside." The congregation spilled into the town square like water from an overturned bucket, forming a loose circle around the drama unfolding in their midst. The sun beat down mercilessly, but Natalia felt cold despite her shawl. Joshua Hawthorne appeared from the crowd, unfolding an official-looking document. His voice rang out with obvious satisfaction. "By order of the county court, Edgar Hawthorne is hereby granted temporary control of all business assets and properties currently held by Natalia Hawthorne Boone, pending review of her fitness to manage said holdings." "No." Natalia stepped forward, steel in her spine. "Those ledgers are my mother's legacy. Every entry balanced, every account true. I demand—" "You see?" Joshua cut her off, gesturing dramatically to the crowd. "Listen to her tone. Is this the behavior of someone thinking clearly? Someone fit to manage a business that serves our whole community?" Natalia looked desperately at the faces around her. People she'd known all her life. People whose children she'd helped tend. Whose accounts she'd managed fairly through drought and plenty. But they turned away, one by one. Mothers hushing curious children. Men suddenly fascinated by the dust at their feet. The sun tracked across the sky, marking each painful hour as the machinery of her family's betrayal ground forward. Papers were signed, statements taken, sympathy offered with averted eyes. By dusk, Natalia stood alone outside the mercantile's familiar facade, its windows dark for the first time in her memory. Joshua approached, hand extended. "The keys, if you please." Natalia's fingers tightened around the iron ring, feeling each notch and curve. The back door key her mother had first pressed into her small hand, the office key she'd earned at 16, the new lock she'd added to protect the ledgers. "Natalia," her father's voice, heavy with false concern. "Don't make this more difficult." The keys dropped into Joshua's waiting palm with a dull jingle. He smiled, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes, and turned away. Margaret's skirts whispered across the boardwalk as she followed, one gloved hand resting possessively on Edgar's arm. Natalia stood motionless as darkness crept across the square. The evening stage rattled past, kicking up dust that settled on her mother's blue shawl. No one met her gaze. No one spoke. Even Reverend Miles hurried past with only a mumbled, "God be with you." She remained there as the last light faded from the sky, watching shadows claim the building that had been her world since childhood. The mercantile's dark windows stared back like unseeing eyes, holding all her memories behind their glass. Her mother teaching her to write her first receipt. The day they added the candy counter. The ledger where she'd recorded her mother's final business dealing, ink smudged with tears. Everything that defined her life, her independence, her purpose, her mother's legacy, had been stripped away in a single Sunday. And yet, Natalia straightened her shoulders, adjusting the faded blue shawl with deliberate care. The truth lived in those ledgers. Numbers didn't lie, as her mother always said. And truth, like hope, had a way of coming to light. Natalia sat at her childhood bedroom window, watching shadows lengthen across the garden her mother had planted years ago. The familiar rose-patterned wallpaper and well-worn quilt should have brought comfort, but tonight they felt like prison walls closing in. Her fingers traced the smooth wood of the desk where she'd learned her first sums, trying to draw strength from the memory. "It will all sort itself out," she whispered, echoing her mother's favorite saying, "Numbers don't lie." A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door creaked open, and Edgar Hawthorne's tall figure filled the doorway. His face held that particular blend of concern and authority that had become more common since Margaret entered their lives. "Natalia." He stepped into the room, leaving the door ajar. "I hope you're feeling more settled." She turned from the window, spine straight. "Father, we both know there's nothing wrong with my mind or my bookkeeping, once the ledgers are reviewed." "Daughter," he cut her off with a raised hand. "This agitation proves our point. You need rest, time to recover yourself." His voice softened. "Trust your family. We only want what's best for you." "Best for me?" Natalia kept her voice steady through sheer will. "Or best for Joshua's ambitions to control the mercantile?" Edgar's face tightened. "That's exactly the sort of unfounded accusation I mean. Margaret has noticed how you've grown suspicious, paranoid even. It's not like you, Natalia." "Margaret has noticed many things, it seems." Natalia couldn't quite keep the bitterness from her tone. "Including a doctor's evaluation I never received." Her father shifted uncomfortably. "Dr. Morrison is well respected. His opinion of what? He hasn't examined me." She stood, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Did you even question that, Father? Or did you simply sign what was put before you?" "Enough!" The sharp word echoed in the small room. Edgar drew a deep breath, visibly composing himself. "Rest, Natalia. Let your family handle things for now. Please." He turned and left, closing the door firmly behind him. Natalia listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway, then began counting slowly to 100 as she had as a child, waiting until the house settled into evening silence. The first gray light of dawn found her already dressed and mounting her horse. The morning air held autumn's bite, and her breath frosted as she urged her mare toward Dr. Morrison's house on the edge of town. She had to know the truth. The doctor's wife answered her knock, looking surprised to find anyone calling so early. "Why, Miss Hawthorne, the doctor's just finishing breakfast." "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison." Natalia managed a polite smile. "I won't take much of his time. It's rather urgent." Dr. Morrison proved easier to find than to convince. He hemmed and hawed, shuffling papers on his desk while avoiding her direct gaze. "Well, you see, Miss Hawthorne, your stepmother brought me some very concerning reports. Your father's observations, statements from townspeople. But you never examined me yourself?" Natalia pressed, watching his face carefully. The doctor's fingers drummed nervously on his desk. "The documentation was quite thorough. Mrs. Hawthorne assured me it was a mere formality for legal purposes." So you signed a statement about my mental state without ever speaking to me. She kept her voice level, but her hands clenched in her skirts. Now see here, he blustered, finally meeting her eyes. Your family has been pillars of this community for years. When they express concern about a loved one's welfare— Thank you, doctor. Natalia stood, cutting off his justifications. You've made things very clear. She rode straight to the mercantile, hope warring with dread in her chest. Surely Joshua couldn't have moved so quickly with the legal proceedings. But as she approached, she saw him standing on the boardwalk like a guard at his post. Good morning, dear sister. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Shouldn't you be resting? I've come to review the ledgers, she said firmly, moving towards the door. Joshua stepped smoothly into her path. I'm afraid that won't be possible. The business is under new management now, all quite legal and proper. The county clerk has the papers already. Already? Natalia's voice sharpened. The accusations were only made yesterday. Emergency provisions. He patted his vest pocket. For cases requiring swift action. To protect all parties involved, you understand. She studied his smug expression, realization dawning. You had those papers prepared before yesterday. This whole thing was planned. Such paranoid thoughts. Joshua clicked his tongue. Perhaps Margaret is right about you needing more intensive care. Natalia turned away before he could see how deeply that threat landed. She spent the rest of the day in her room, methodically going through her mother's old correspondence box by lamplight. Letter after letter revealed gaps she hadn't noticed before, responses to messages she'd never seen, references to business matters that had somehow resolved without her input. The sun set, and still she searched, looking for proof of her own competence among the scattered papers. How long had Margaret been intercepting her mail? How many decisions had been quietly undermined, preparing for this moment? Near midnight, voices drifted up from the parlor below. Natalia crept to the heating grate, straining to hear. Arrangements are nearly complete. Margaret's cultured tones carried clearly. The sanitarium in Boston is very discreet. They understand the need for quick admission in these difficult family situations. And the timing? Joshua's voice now, sharp with impatience. 3 days. The doctor's statement gives us grounds to act for her own protection. Once she's safely settled in treatment, we can begin reorganizing the business properly. Good. She's too much like her mother. Too many questions. Too much digging through records. A chair scraped across the floor. I won't have her interfering with our plans. Natalia pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling any sound that might betray her presence. The voices moved. Away. But their words echoed in her mind with terrible clarity. 3 days. They meant to send her away, lock her up where she couldn't challenge their control of everything her mother had built. She waited until the house fell silent, then began to move with careful purpose. A small carpet bag emerged from under her bed. Into it went her mother's letters, a change of clothes, the little cash she kept hidden in her sewing box. The blue shawl went last, wrapped around her mother's Bible. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when Natalia finished her preparations. She stood in her childhood room one last time, committing every detail to memory. The rose wallpaper, the worn quilt, the desk where she'd learned that numbers tell truth when people might lie. All of it would be lost to her soon, along with so much more. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper from the shadows. Sometimes, child, the bravest thing is knowing when to walk away, so you can come back stronger. Natalia straightened her shoulders and turned toward the door. They had taken her business, her reputation, and now threatened her freedom. But they hadn't counted on one thing. She was her mother's daughter, trained to see truth in ledgers and letters, and truth, she knew, had a way of coming to light if someone was brave enough to seek it. The pre-dawn air bit through Natalia's shawl as she crouched behind stacked crates at the mercantile's back door. Her breath made small clouds in the darkness while she waited, counting her heartbeats. 20 more minutes until Carlos, Mrs. Ortega's cousin, would arrive with his wagon. The arrangement had been made in whispers the previous evening, when Teresa Ortega had slipped into her room under pretense of delivering mending. "My cousin drives north tomorrow before sunrise," Mrs. Ortega had murmured, pressing a small package of cornbread and dried meat into Natalia's hands. "He will not ask questions." Now Natalia clutched her carpetbag closer, its precious contents safely hidden. Her mother's Bible, the rescued ledger, and what remained of her life in this town. The sound of wagon wheels made her sink deeper into shadow. But it was only old Mr. Peterson's milk cart rattling past on its morning rounds. The eastern sky had just begun showing traces of pearl when she heard the subtle whistle. 3 low notes, just as Mrs. Ortega had promised. Carlos's wagon appeared at the corner, moving slowly to muffle the sound of its wheels. Natalia hurried forward, keeping low. "Señorita?" Carlos barely breathed the word as he reached down to help her up. His weathered face showed no judgment, only quiet determination. "Keep down under the blankets until we clear town." Natalia nestled into the bed of the wagon, letting Carlos arrange burlap sacks and old quilts over her. The rough fabric scratched her cheek, but she didn't dare move. Through a small gap, she watched the sleeping town slide past. The general store where she'd learned to count, inventory. The church where yesterday's betrayal had begun. The schoolhouse where she'd once taught Sunday lessons. They passed the town limits without challenge. Only then did Carlos whisper it was safe to sit up. Natalia emerged from her nest of blankets, brushing hay from her skirts. The rising sun painted the prairie grass gold, while ahead, the foothills rose blue and promising against the sky. "I can take you as far as the old Thompson place," Carlos said, his eyes on the road. "After that, the wagon track gets too rough." Natalia nodded, already knowing she would need to go further. She pulled out her mother's Bible, letting it fall open to the familiar spot where a letter was pressed between the pages. Her mother's neat handwriting filled the creased paper. "Remember, my darling, that truth is like water. It will find its way through any barrier, given time and persistence. Keep your accounts clear and your conscience clearer. In this way, no one can truly steal what is rightfully yours." The wagon creaked steadily northward, while morning stretched toward noon. Natalia studied the hidden ledger she'd managed to save, the one recording water rights and land transfers her mother had carefully documented, the one proving how Joshua had slowly diverted creek access from smaller farms to his own holdings. Carlos drove cautiously, taking lesser-used tracks when possible. They stopped only once, to rest the horses and share a simple meal of cornbread and dried apple slices. The sun had passed its peak when Carlos pointed to a distant smudge of trees. "Thompson's old place," he said quietly. "Beyond there, no towns for 3 days' ride. The track turns to deer trails. You sure about this, señorita?" Natalia looked ahead at the wild country. Fear flickered in her chest, but determination burned stronger. "I'm sure. There's nothing left behind me now." Carlos's expression softened with understanding. "My cousin Teresa, she says you are brave like your mother. She would be proud, I think." They reached the abandoned Thompson homestead as afternoon light began to fade. Wind whipped down from the mountains, carrying the first real bite of winter. Carlos helped Natalia down from the wagon, pressing a small packet of matches into her hand. "Follow the creek north," he advised, pointing to where water glinted through trees. "Stay close to it. Water means life out here." He hesitated. "You sure you won't wait until spring?" Natalia shook her head. 3 days, Carlos. That's all I have before they try to send me east. I have to find help now." He nodded gravely. "Vaya con Dios, señorita." Natalia watched until the wagon disappeared around a bend, then turned toward the creek. Her sturdy boots, at least, were made for walking, though her skirts caught on every bush. The wind grew fiercer as sunset approached, driving clouds across the sky in ragged herds. She followed the creek's winding course, checking her direction against the setting sun. Her mother's shawl offered little protection against the mounting cold. Her legs ached from hours of walking. Still, she pushed on, knowing each step took her further from those who would steal her freedom. Twilight crept in like a gray curtain, making the path treacherous. Natalia stumbled more often now, her feet catching on hidden roots and rocks. The creek's song became her guide when darkness made the trail nearly invisible. She pulled her shawl tighter, trying to trap what little warmth remained in her body. The first snowflakes began falling just as her strength finally failed. Her legs buckled, sending her to her knees beside the creek. The carpetbag slipped from numb fingers. She tried to rise, but could not. Cold had worked too deeply into her bones. "Just rest a moment," she whispered to herself, knowing the danger but unable to fight it. Her eyelids felt weighted with lead. Through blurring vision, she thought she saw lamplight gleaming between trees. But that was surely a dream. No one lived this far into the wilderness. The light grew stronger, accompanied by the crunch of approaching footsteps. Natalia tried to lift her head, to call out, but her body refused to respond. She was distantly aware of a massive shadow moving toward her through the swirling snow. Then strong arms were lifting her, gentle despite their obvious power. Her head rolled against a broad chest that smelled of wood smoke and pine. She managed to open her eyes once as her rescuer carried her. In the dim light, she caught a glimpse of a bearded face set in lines of quiet concern. Then exhaustion claimed her, and she knew nothing more. Samuel Boone moved with careful purpose through the deepening night, cradling his unexpected burden. He had seen the slight figure collapse from his cabin window and hadn't hesitated. Now he could feel how cold she was, even through his heavy coat. The storm was worsening, but his cabin lay just ahead, its lamplight a steady beacon in the darkness. He ducked through the door, which he'd left standing open in his haste. The cabin's warmth wrapped around them as he gently laid the unconscious woman on his bed. Without a word, he turned to stoke the fire higher, then reached for the extra blankets he kept ready for winter nights. The woman hadn't stirred, but her breathing was steady. Samuel worked efficiently, removing her snow-dampened shoes and covering her with layers of warm wool. He retrieved her dropped carpetbag from where he'd set it by the door, placing it within easy reach of the bed. Only then did he settle into his chair by the fire to keep watch, as the storm raged outside and his unexpected guest slept the deep sleep of exhaustion. Dawn would bring questions, but for now, the simple duties of mercy were enough. Warmth touched Natalia's face first, drawing her slowly back to consciousness. She blinked, finding herself wrapped in thick quilts beside a crackling fire. For a moment, confusion clouded her mind. This wasn't her bedroom at the Mercantile. Then memory rushed back. The escape, the long journey north, collapsing in the snow. The cabin around her was simply furnished, but meticulously neat. A pot bubbled over the fire, filling the air with the rich scent of venison stew. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a collection of well-maintained tools lined one wall. Everything spoke of careful hands and ordered living. Movement drew her attention to a large figure by the hearth. Samuel Boone stood stirring the pot, his broad shoulders blocking much of the firelight. He turned at her rustling movement, and Natalia saw his face clearly for the first time. Weathered but kind, with eyes that held both strength and gentleness. "You're safe here," he said simply, his voice low and steady. "Storm's blown in hard. Best rest while you can." Natalia pushed herself to sitting, keeping the quilts close. Her clothes had dried in the warmth, though her boots stood empty by the door. "Thank you, Mr. Boone. I don't know how to repay your kindness." He shook his head, already ladling stew into a tin bowl. "No payment needed for doing what's right." He brought her the bowl and a spoon, then stepped back to give her space. "Eat, get your strength back." The stew was hearty and well-seasoned, telling Natalia this man knew more than mere survival cooking. She ate slowly, aware of her host's quiet presence as he moved about the cabin, adding wood to the fire and checking the storm through a small window. When she finished, he took the empty bowl without comment. From a trunk near the bed, he drew out another quilt, this one clearly handmade, with careful stitching in a pattern of mountain flowers. "My Sarah made this," he said softly, offering it to her. "Reckon she'd want it used on a cold night like this?" Natalia accepted the quilt with reverence, understanding the gift's weight. "She had skilled hands," she said quietly, running her fingers over the precise stitches. Samuel nodded once, a flash of old grief crossing his face. He didn't speak of Sarah again that night, but the shared quilt formed a bridge of trust between them. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping them in the cabin's warm confines. Samuel proved a courteous host, giving Natalia space while ensuring her comfort. He kept the fire well-fed and the stew pot full, worked at small tasks around the cabin, and never pressed her with questions. Gradually, in her own time, Natalia began to speak. She told him first of her mother, who had taught her business and bookkeeping alongside scripture and compassion. Then of the careful records she'd kept, documenting how water rights were being diverted from smaller farms. Finally, she spoke of that terrible Sunday and its aftermath, the public humiliation, the legal trap, the threatened confinement. Samuel listened without interruption, his hands steady at whatever task occupied them. Whittling, mending, cooking. Only his eyes showed his thoughts, darkening at mentions of injustice, but warming with approval at her mother's teachings. On the second evening, as wind howled outside, Samuel shared his own story. "I was a different man once," he said, voice rough with memory. "Believed in the law, in speaking loud for justice. Then Sarah took sick. Town doctor wouldn't come out this far. Said the weather was too poor, the pay too little. She died while I was riding for help." He paused, feeding another log to the fire. "After that, I saw how justice worked different for different folks. Learned to trust quiet truth more than loud words. Been up here since, trading furs and helping where I can." Natalia understood then why he'd asked no questions when finding her in the snow. His own loss had taught him when to offer shelter first and seek answers later. The storm began to ease on the third morning. Samuel announced he needed supplies from the trading post, a half-day's ride away. "Best I hear what word's spreading," he added, pulling on his heavy coat. "Stay warm. I'll be back before dark." Natalia spent the day tidying the cabin, finding comfort in useful work. She discovered Sarah's old recipe box and prepared a batch of cornbread, letting the familiar task settle her thoughts. The afternoon light was fading when she heard hoofbeats returning. Samuel's expression was grave as he stamped snow from his boots. Word's already reached the trading post about a disturbed young woman who needs finding. Seems your family's moving fast to spread their story. Natalia's hands clenched in her skirts. How long before they search this far north? Not till spring, likely. Snow's closing the passes soon. He began unpacking supplies: coffee, flour, salt pork. Could offer you sanctuary here through winter, if you've a mind to stay. Ask only honest work and truth between us. Natalia studied him carefully. Why would you take such risk for a stranger? Samuel's eyes met hers steadily. Because I've seen what happens when good folks stay silent in the face of wrong. My cabin's small, but it's honest shelter. Your choice to make. That evening, they shared a simple supper of cornbread and stew. When Samuel bowed his head for grace, Natalia found her voice joining his for the first time since that terrible Sunday. Her words came slow but steady, thanking God for safety, for honest shelter, for the dignity of choice restored. In the firelight, she saw Samuel's slight smile of approval. Here was a place where truth could wait out the winter, gathering strength like a seed beneath snow. Here, she could begin to rebuild what had been stolen, not just property, but faith in justice itself. The mountain wind sang around the cabin's sturdy walls as they finished their meal in comfortable silence. Outside, the first stars pricked through breaking clouds, bright and unwavering as truth itself. Weeks melted into a peaceful rhythm at the mountain cabin. December's early snow draped the evergreens in white, transforming the landscape into a pristine blanket of silence. Inside, Natalia found her place in the daily routines that kept their small world turning. Each morning, she rose before dawn to kindle the fire and start breakfast, while Samuel checked his nearby trap lines. The quiet hours gave her time to reflect on how different her life had become. Instead of the mercantile's crowded shelves and constant demands, she now lived by simpler measures: the level of flour in the barrel, the stack of kindling by the hearth, the careful accounting of Samuel's fur trades in a fresh ledger. Samuel proved to be a patient teacher. He showed her how to identify animal tracks in the snow, preserve food for winter storage, and tend to the few hardy chickens that scratched in their sheltered coop. His instruction came more through demonstration than words, his capable hands guiding hers when needed. One evening, as wind whistled through the cabin's chinked logs, Natalia sat cross-legged before the fire, sorting through her meager belongings. Her fingers brushed against something familiar: her mother's old land ledger, its leather cover worn smooth from years of use. She hadn't noticed it among the items she'd grabbed during her hasty escape. "What's that you found?" Samuel asked, looking up from where he was cleaning his rifle. Natalia ran her fingers over the cover. "My mother's ledger. She kept records of every land and water claim in the territory." Opening it carefully, she showed him the neat columns of dates and numbers. "She taught me that water rights were more precious than gold out here." Samuel set aside his work and moved closer, studying the careful entries. "Your mother was right about that. Water's life itself in these parts." He pointed to a particular section. "These markings here, they're about the creek that runs past our cabin." "The same creek I followed the night you found me?" Natalia leaned in, squinting at her mother's precise handwriting in the lamplight. "That's right. It feeds down from the high country, splits into 3 branches. Town below claims 2 branches now, but that third one..." He traced the path with his finger. "Your mother's notes show she filed rights on it years ago." Natalia's heart quickened. "And those rights were never sold or transferred?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "Not according to these records. By law, they'd still be held in trust, part of your mother's estate." They spent hours poring over the ledger, Samuel explaining how water rights worked in the territory, while Natalia matched her mother's notes to current claims. As the night deepened, a picture emerged of carefully preserved water access that her father's recent actions hadn't touched. Outside, snow fell steadily, drumming softly on the cabin roof. Travel beyond their immediate surroundings had become impossible as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. The isolation that had first seemed like exile now felt like a gift, giving Natalia time to understand the full scope of her inheritance. Several nights later, they sat before the fire after supper, Samuel whittling while Natalia darned a sock. The comfortable silence between them had become as natural as breathing. "Sometimes," Natalia said softly, breaking the quiet, "I wake up afraid that I'm already erased, that my father and Margaret have already written me out of existence with their tales of my instability." Her hands stilled in her lap. "What if no one remembers who I really am?" Samuel set aside his whittling, regarding her thoughtfully. "Been thinking on that myself," he said. "Got a proposal for you. Not born of rescue, mind you, but partnership." Natalia looked up, meeting his steady gaze. "Would you consider taking my name?" he continued. "Not to hide behind, but to stand with. Marriage would give you legal protection, and my word carries weight with the territorial judge." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm offering partnership, Natalia. You'd keep your voice, your rights. I'd never ask you to be silent about what's true." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Natalia studied the man before her, his weathered face honest in the lamplight, his offer as straightforward as everything else about him. "You'd do that?" she asked quietly. "Knowing my family might come looking?" "Truth needs defenders," he replied simply. "And you've proved yourself worthy of trust these weeks past. I reckon we could build something good together, if you're willing." Natalia thought of her mother's teachings about marriage, that it should be founded on respect, nurture strength in both partners, and serve God's purpose. What Samuel offered matched those ideals perfectly. "Yes," she said finally, her voice clear and certain. "I would be honored to be your wife." Samuel's smile was gentle. "Then we'll make it proper. First chance we get." That chance came sooner than expected. 2 days later, a circuit preacher knocked at their door, his horse exhausted from fighting through the snow. Samuel and Natalia offered him shelter from the storm, sharing their evening meal as he told tales of his travels through the territory. When he mentioned his authority to perform marriages, Samuel and Natalia exchanged a look. The preacher, noting their silent communication, smiled kindly. "Would you two be needing those services?" They were married that very night by candlelight. Samuel had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band that fit Natalia's finger as if it had been made for her. The preacher read from his travel-worn Bible, his words filling the cabin with time-honored promises of faith and devotion. Natalia wore her mother's blue shawl, its familiar warmth now part of this new beginning. Samuel stood tall beside her, his quiet strength a foundation she could trust. Their voices joined clearly in their vows, witnessed by God and their honored guest. After the ceremony, while the preacher dozed in the rocking chair, Natalia sat at the table with her mother's ledger. With steady hands, she opened to a fresh page and wrote in her clear script, "Natalia Boone." The name felt right, not an escape from who she was, but a step toward who she could become. Samuel came to stand behind her, resting one hand gently on her shoulder. Together they looked at her new name, knowing it represented not just their marriage, but a choice to face whatever came next as equal partners. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain sanctuary in pristine white. Inside, warmth and candlelight wrapped around them like a blessing, marking this moment of choosing stability and rebirth over mere escape. The ledger lay open before them, Natalia's new name, a promise written in ink and witnessed by flickering flames. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they had created something true and strong, a foundation built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Welcome home, Mrs. Boone," Samuel said softly, and Natalia smiled, knowing she had found not just shelter, but belonging. The mountain spring arrived with gentle persistence. Snow retreated inch by inch, revealing patches of damp earth that steamed in the strengthening sunlight. Tiny green shoots pushed through the melting drifts, and the creek's voice grew from a whisper to a song as winter's ice released its grip. Natalia stood on the cabin's porch one clear morning, watching Samuel check the horse's tack. The past months of winter seclusion had changed her. Her hands were stronger now, her confidence quiet but sure. The woman who had fled in desperation had grown into someone different, someone who could wait, watch, and plan. "Trail should be clear all the way to Madison's trading post," Samuel said, adjusting a stirrup. "Time we restocked our supplies." He glanced at her. "Ready for your first ride out?" Natalia nodded, touching the ledger safely stowed in her saddlebag. "More than ready." They mounted up as the sun crested the eastern ridge. Samuel led them along paths still muddy with snowmelt, but passable. The horses picked their way carefully, hooves clicking on exposed stone. Around them, the forest stirred with new life, birdsong and the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. By midday, the trading post's weather-beaten sign came into view. Samuel touched her arm lightly. "Remember what we discussed. You're Natalia Boone here, my wife of 6 months, come from back east." "I remember." She straightened her spine, settling into this new identity that was both truth and shelter. The trading post was busy with the spring rush, trappers trading winter furs, homesteaders restocking depleted supplies, travelers pausing for news and rest. Natalia dismounted gracefully, smoothing her simple dress. Her mother's blue shawl was carefully packed away now, too recognizable for this first venture out. Inside, the post's owner, Madison himself, greeted Samuel warmly. "Boone, survived another winter, I see." His eyes turned curiously to Natalia. "And who's this?" "My wife," Samuel said simply. "Natalia Boone." Madison's weathered face creased in a smile. "Well, now that's news. Didn't take you for the marrying kind anymore, Boone." He extended a calloused hand to Natalia. "Welcome to our little corner of the territory, Mrs. Boone." Natalia shook his hand firmly, noting how easily her new name was accepted. No one here connected her to the Hawthorne scandal. It was exactly as she and Samuel had hoped. While Samuel discussed fur prices, Natalia moved through the store, gathering supplies and listening. The post was a crossroads of information, and people talked freely around a quiet woman with a shopping basket. "Railroad survey crew coming through next month. Water rights dispute down in Miller's Valley. Hawthorne Mercantile buying up land along the creek." Each snippet of news she filed away carefully, building a picture of the territory's changing landscape. When they settled their account, she asked Madison casually about subscribing to the territorial newspaper. "Be glad to add you to the delivery list, Mrs. Boone," he said. "Mail rider comes through every few weeks, weather permitting." On their next visit, 3 weeks later, a stack of delayed mail waited for them. Among the newspapers were letters from town, forwarded through a complicated route Samuel had arranged with trusted contacts. Natalia waited until they were home to read them. By lamplight, she sorted through the correspondence. Her hands trembled slightly as she confirmed what they'd suspected. Her father and Margaret had consolidated their control. The mercantile, her mother's properties, even her personal accounts, all now legally under family management. Samuel watched her from across the table. "You could challenge it now," he said quietly. "We have enough saved for legal fees." Natalia shook her head, touching the ledger that never left her possession. "Not yet. Mother always said timing was everything in business." She smiled slightly. "And in justice." Throughout the summer, they settled into a rhythm. Every few weeks they rode to the trading post, gathering supplies and information. Natalia kept careful notes of everything she learned: land sales, water disputes, railroad negotiations. She made copies of every important document, storing them in multiple safe locations. Their cabin became a way station for travelers, its reputation for hospitality spreading through the territory. Each guest brought news and connections, which Natalia carefully cultivated. She served coffee, listened to stories, and quietly built a network of people who knew her as the capable, clear-headed Mrs. Boone. They helped their scattered neighbors, too. Samuel with heavy work and hunting, Natalia with accounts and correspondence. She taught the Anderson children their letters, while their mother recovered from fever. She helped the Wilsons organize their homestead filing papers. Each good turn earned them allies and established their standing in the community. One evening in late summer, they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. A stack of new letters had arrived, bringing more news of her family's maneuvering in town. "Sometimes I feel like a farmer," Natalia said, fingering the latest newspaper. "Planting evidence like seeds, tending it, waiting for the right time to harvest." Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Justice is like that," he said, his deep voice blending with the evening bird songs. "Can't rush it. Has to be planted careful and deep, tended patient and steady." He reached over and took her hand. "And when the time comes, you stand on truth that's got strong roots." Natalia squeezed his hand, grateful again for this partnership that gave her space to rebuild with wisdom rather than haste. The sun settled behind the peaks, painting the clouds in shades of purple and rose. Another day of careful preparation ended, another small step toward the future they were cultivating together. In her lap lay her mother's ledger, now filled with new entries, dates, documents, testimonies, each one a seed planted in fertile soil. The land around them was turning golden with ripening grass, the creek running clear and strong through their property. Like the territory itself, Natalia was growing into something new, not erased, as she had feared, but transformed. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine and late summer flowers. Down in the valley, lights began to twinkle as neighbors' lamps were lit. Each one represented a connection made, a story shared, a thread in the tapestry of community they were weaving. Natalia watched them appear one by one, remembering how alone she had felt that desperate night months ago. Now she had not just Samuel's protection, but a growing circle of people who knew her true character. Each letter she wrote, each conversation she had, each document she filed built another layer of evidence against the day when truth would need to speak louder than lies. As darkness settled over the mountains, Natalia sat content in the knowledge that some things grew stronger in shadow. Like the roots of the great pines around them, her preparation ran deep and sure, drawing strength from the very ground that others thought would bury her. The autumn air held a crisp bite as Natalia and Samuel guided their horses toward the territorial reservation agency. Golden aspen leaves drifted down around them, carpeting the trail. Natalia adjusted her shawl against the morning chill, her saddlebags heavy with trading goods. "Remember," Samuel said quietly, "we're here to trade and gather information. Nothing more." His deep voice carried concern. "No need to draw attention." Natalia nodded, touching the carefully prepared documents in her bag. "I understand. Slow and steady, like you taught me." The agency building came into view, a sturdy two-story structure of rough-hewn logs with a newly constructed addition. Several wagons were already parked outside, their owners conducting various business inside. Samuel helped Natalia dismount, then tied their horses to the hitching post. Inside, the main room buzzed with activity. A mixture of settlers, native families, and officials moved between desks and counters. The air smelled of paper, ink, and wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove in the corner. Natalia followed Samuel to the trading counter, where they began arranging their goods: dried herbs, preserved fruit, and handcrafted items from their neighbors. While Samuel handled the trading, Natalia's attention was drawn to a young clerk working at a corner desk. He appeared overwhelmed, struggling to organize a stack of water rights documents that threatened to topple over. Without hesitation, she approached him. "Would you like some help with those?" she offered. "I have experience with filing systems." The clerk, whose nameplate read Thomas Wheeler, looked up with visible relief. "That would be wonderful, Mrs. Boone," Natalia supplied. "Natalia Boone." Over the next hour, as Samuel continued trading, Natalia helped Thomas organize the wayward papers. She worked methodically, demonstrating a filing system her mother had taught her. All the while, her eyes caught glimpses of familiar names and locations. "You're quite skilled at this," Thomas remarked. "Most folks can barely read these forms, let alone organize them." Natalia smiled modestly. "My mother taught me the importance of proper record-keeping." She paused, lifting a particular document. "These water rights filings go back quite far." "Oh yes," Thomas said, warming to the subject. "Some date to the territory's earliest settlements. Those old claims still stand, too, if they were properly filed and maintained." Over the following weeks, Natalia and Samuel made regular trips to the agency. Each time she volunteered to help Thomas with various filing tasks. Her assistance was always welcomed. The young clerk was overworked and grateful for her organizational skills. During one visit, while sorting through old records, Natalia carefully extracted the information she sought. There, in fading ink, but still legally binding, were her mother's original water rights filings. The documents proved what she had suspected. The claims had never been properly transferred or voided. "These older filings," she asked Thomas casually, "they're still valid?" "Absolutely," he replied, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "As long as the original paperwork is intact and there's no record of transfer or abandonment, those rights remain legally binding. That's why we keep such detailed records." Natalia's heart quickened, but she maintained her composed expression. "How fascinating. Would it be possible to get certified copies of some of these for historical research?" Thomas was happy to oblige. "Of course. We're required to provide copies upon request. Just fill out this form here." Over subsequent visits, Natalia carefully gathered certified copies of crucial documents. She worked systematically, never requesting too many at once, always maintaining her cover as an interested researcher. Samuel supported her efforts while ensuring everything remained strictly legal. Their network of contacts grew. Travelers passing through their homestead shared stories and signed statements about water usage and land dealings. Natalia documented everything meticulously, creating multiple copies stored in different locations. At the trading post, Madison unwittingly provided valuable information about recent land purchases and water disputes. Natalia recorded every detail in her ledger, building a comprehensive picture of how the territory's resources were being allocated and manipulated. One crisp morning, while helping Thomas with quarterly reports, Natalia discovered additional documents that strengthened her position. Records showed that recent water rights claims conflicted with her mother's original filings. She carefully requested copies, explaining they related to her research into early settlement patterns. "Mrs. Boone," Thomas said, handing over the certified copies, "you've been such a help here. I wish more people understood the importance of proper documentation. These records protect people's rights, Natalia replied, carefully storing the papers in her bag. That's worth preserving. Samuel watched these developments with quiet support, though his protective nature sometimes showed through. Just be careful, he warned one evening as they rode home. Don't let eagerness override caution. I won't, Natalia assured him. Everything we're doing is legal and above board. We're simply gathering truth that already exists. Their home became a careful repository of evidence. Natalia created a hidden space beneath the floorboards where she stored the most important documents. Each piece of paper represented another thread in the tapestry of truth she was weaving. The reservation agency became a regular part of their routine. Natalia's help was so valued that her presence raised no eyebrows. She worked steadily, earning trust while gathering proof. Thomas often sought her advice on organizing the ever-growing collection of territorial records. I don't know how we managed before you started helping, he commented one afternoon. You have a real gift for this work. Natalia smiled, thinking of her mother's patient lessons in record-keeping. Good systems make truth easier to find, she replied, carefully filing another certified copy into her satchel. Samuel supported her efforts while ensuring they maintained their cover. He expanded their trading routes, creating legitimate reasons for their regular visits to the agency. Their reputation for fair dealing and reliability grew throughout the territory. As autumn deepened, Natalia's collection of evidence grew stronger. She had official copies of her mother's water, rights, sworn statements from longtime settlers, and documentation of recent land dealings that conflicted with established claims. Each piece was carefully verified, copied, and stored. Your mother would be proud, Samuel said one evening, as he watched Natalia updating her ledger. You're fighting with truth instead of force. Natalia nodded, touching the pages that held so much power. Truth doesn't need violence to be strong. It just needs to be preserved and presented at the right time. The season was drawing to a close. Their last visit to the agency for the year would need to happen soon, before winter storms made travel impossible. Natalia made sure she had copies of everything vital, cross-referenced and certified. On their final autumn trip, Thomas helped her locate a few remaining documents. I'll miss your help this winter, he said as he stamped the official seal on her last requested copy. You've brought real order to our records. I'm grateful for your trust, Natalia replied sincerely. Proper records protect everyone's rights. As they rode home that afternoon, the air grew sharper. Samuel pointed to heavy clouds gathering over the mountains. Storm's coming. We made it just in time. Natalia clutched her saddlebag, feeling the weight of the documents inside. Yes, we did. At home, she carefully organized her latest acquisitions. The hidden compartment beneath the floorboards now held a comprehensive collection of evidence, proof of her mother's valid claims, documentation of recent illegal dealings, and sworn statements from reliable witnesses. As she secured the last bundle of papers, something cold and wet touched her cheek through the window. Looking up, she saw the first snowflake of winter drifting down. More followed, dancing in the fading light. Natalia locked the compartment and replaced the floorboard. Above ground, winter was beginning its reign, but beneath the surface, truth lay protected, waiting for spring. Snow blanketed the mountain valley, transforming Samuel and Natalia's homestead into a peaceful winter sanctuary. Inside their warm cabin, Natalia sat at the rough-hewn table beside 8-year-old Mary Cooper, whose family had settled nearby the previous autumn. Sound it out slowly, Natalia encouraged, her finger tracking beneath the words in the worn primer. The lamplight cast a gentle glow over the pages. Mary's brow furrowed in concentration. The quick brown fox. That's right, Natalia smiled, remembering how her own mother had taught her to read at this same age. You're doing wonderfully. The girl beamed at the praise, then carefully continued sounding out each word. Outside, the winter wind whistled through snow-laden pines, but inside the cabin remained cozy, warmed by the crackling hearth and the smell of fresh-baked bread. Samuel sat in his chair by the fire, whittling a new handle for one of his traps. He looked up occasionally, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched his wife guide the child through her lesson. Jumped over the lazy dog, Mary finished triumphantly. Perfect, Natalia squeezed the girl's shoulder. You've improved so much since we started. Ma says reading's important, Mary said, carefully closing the primer. She wants me to help with the trading post accounts when I'm bigger. Your mother's right, Natalia replied. Reading opens up whole new worlds. She glanced at Samuel, who nodded in quiet agreement. The lesson concluded as Sarah Cooper, Mary's mother, arrived to collect her daughter. The women chatted briefly about future reading sessions, while Mary bundled up in her winter wraps. After the Coopers departed, Natalia began preparing their evening meal. Samuel set aside his whittling and watched her move about the cabin with practiced ease. The domestic routine they'd established over the past year felt as natural as breathing. You're good with children, he observed softly. Natalia smiled as she stirred the stew pot. Mary reminds me of myself at that age, so eager to learn, to understand everything. Samuel was quiet for a moment, then asked, Are you happy here, Natalia? She turned to face him, surprised by the question. Of course I am. Why do you ask? He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the snowy landscape. You've built a life here, made friends, helped neighbors. He paused, then continued gently. Do you wish to remain hidden forever? The question hung in the air between them. Natalia set down her wooden spoon, considering her response. The past year had brought her peace she'd never expected to find after fleeing her family's betrayal. Here in the mountains, she'd discovered not just safety, but purpose, community, and love. Before she could answer, heavy hoofbeats approached through the snow. Samuel moved to the door, hand instinctively reaching for his rifle, but relaxed when he recognized the rider as Jack Turner, a friend who ran supplies between settlements. Samuel, Mrs. Boone, Jack called out, dismounting quickly. Snow fell from his heavy coat as Samuel ushered him inside. His face was red from the cold, his expression urgent. What brings you out in this weather, Jack? Samuel asked, helping the man warm himself by the fire. News from Down Valley, Jack replied, accepting the cup of coffee Natalia offered. Railroad surveyors were through last week. They're planning a major route right through Hawthorne territory. Natalia's hands tightened around her own coffee cup. Hawthorne territory? Jack nodded, taking a long drink. Your father and brother are backing it, Edgar and Joshua Hawthorne. He didn't notice how still Natalia had become. They're offering water rights to the railroad company, prime access to the creek that runs through that whole stretch of land. Samuel's eyes went to his wife. They both knew which creek Jack meant, the one fed by springs on Natalia's mother's original property. When? Samuel asked, quietly. Contracts are being drawn up now, Jack replied. Once the spring thaw comes, they'll start construction. The railroad's offering good money for those water rights. He shook his head. Thing is, it'll cut off water access to about 20 homesteads downstream. Folks who've been there for years. The Martins, the Wilsons, even that widow Santiago and her children. Natalia set her cup down carefully, her hands trembling slightly. She knew these families, had traded with them, helped them, watched their children grow. The railroad will divert the creek, Jack continued, Those homesteaders will lose their water supply completely. They'll have to sell out or leave." He sighed heavily. "Some folks are saying the Hawthorns engineered it this way. Buy up land cheap when people are forced out." Samuel moved to stand behind Natalia's chair, his presence steady and supportive. "Thank you for bringing us this news, Jack." After Jack departed, promising to return with more information when he could, silence fell in the cabin. Natalia stood and walked to the hearth, staring into the dancing flames. The fire's warmth couldn't touch the cold knowledge settling in her chest. Samuel waited patiently, giving her space to process the news. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could leave it behind, start fresh here." She turned to face her husband. "But they're going to hurt innocent people, Samuel. Families with children. All for profit they have no right to claim." "The choice is yours," he said gently. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Natalia looked down at her hands that had found purpose in this new life, teaching children, helping neighbors, building something honest and good. But those same hands also held proof of her mother's legitimate claims, documents that could protect not just her rights, but the lives and livelihoods of dozens of families. The fire crackled behind her, its light throwing her shadow long across the cabin floor. In that moment, Natalia knew that silence was no longer a righteous choice. Her mother had taught her that truth and justice were not just gifts to be received, but responsibilities to be upheld. She stood at the threshold of a decision that would change everything. The peaceful life she and Samuel had built here in the mountains beckoned like a warm hearth on a cold night. But beyond that comfort lay a harder path, one that demanded courage, truth, and action. The fire popped and sparked, drawing her gaze back to the flames. In their dance, she saw reflected the future she had to choose, not for herself alone, but for Mary Cooper and her family, for Widow Santiago's children, for every family whose lives would be destroyed if she remained silent. Samuel moved to stand beside her, his quiet strength anchoring her as it had since that first night he'd carried her in from the snow. He didn't speak, didn't need to. They both knew that the season of hiding was drawing to a close. Natalia continued to stare into the fire, her decision crystallizing like ice on a winter morning. She had fled to these mountains to escape injustice. Now that same injustice was reaching out to harm others. The time had come to stand and face it. The flames cast shifting shadows on the cabin walls as evening deepened into night. Outside, snow continued to fall, but spring would come. And with it, changes that would affect far more lives than her own. The first hints of spring whispered through the mountain passes. Snow retreated in patches, revealing muddy earth beneath. Inside their cabin, Natalia carefully packed documents into her mother's old leather portfolio, each paper a piece of truth she had gathered through the long winter months. "Everything's here," she said, running her fingers over the worn leather. "Mother's original water rights, the witnessed statements, the survey maps." She glanced up at Samuel, who was loading supplies into travel bags. "Do you think it will be enough?" Samuel paused, considering. Truth usually is, when presented right. He secured another bundle. "Judge Albright's got a reputation for being fair-minded. If your papers are solid, he'll listen." Natalia nodded, touching the blue shawl folded beside the portfolio, her mother's shawl, the one she'd worn that Sunday morning a year ago. She'd kept it safe all these months, a reminder of both loss and persistence. They spent the morning preparing the wagon. Samuel had traded for it weeks ago, knowing they'd need more than horseback for this journey. The wooden wheels were solid, the canvas cover weather-tight. They loaded carefully, provisions, documentation, and small comforts for the 3-day trip. As the sun reached midday, Natalia took a final walk around their cabin. She paused in each familiar space: the hearth where they'd shared countless meals, the table where she'd taught Mary Cooper to read, the window where she'd watched seasons change and found her strength again. "We'll be back," Samuel said quietly from the doorway. "Yes," she agreed, touching the rough-hewn door frame. "But things will be different." They set out as afternoon shadows lengthened. The wagon creaked along the muddy track, Samuel handling the reins while Natalia consulted her maps. They'd chosen their route carefully, avoiding the main roads where they might be recognized. That first night, they made camp in a sheltered hollow. As Samuel tended the horses, Natalia spread her papers on a flat rock, reviewing each document by firelight. She'd done this countless times over winter, but now every detail felt crucial. "You know these better than your own name," Samuel observed, settling beside her with coffee. "I have to be perfect," she replied, arranging the papers in sequence. "No accusations, no emotion, just facts and dates and signatures." Samuel watched her practiced movements. "You've changed this past year." "How so?" "You're stronger, calmer." He smiled, slightly. "More dangerous in a way." Natalia considered this. "I've learned patience," she said finally. "Mother always said truth doesn't need shouting, it just needs sunlight." They slept that night under canvas, the spring wind carrying scents of thaw and renewal. Natalia dreamed of ledgers and water rights, of justice flowing like the creek near their cabin. The second day brought them down from the foothills. The wagon rocked over increasingly traveled roads. They passed other travelers, merchants, farmers, families heading to market. Natalia kept her face turned away, though she doubted anyone would recognize her now. Marriage and mountain living had altered more than just her name. They stopped at midday to rest the horses. While Samuel checked the wagon wheels, Natalia practiced her presentation. "The original filing dates to 1863, she recited quietly, "witnessed by 3 parties and recorded with the territorial office." "You sound like a lawyer," Samuel commented, straightening up from his inspection. "I sound like my mother," Natalia corrected, smiling slightly. "She taught me that proper records are better than arguments." They made good time that afternoon, the horses steady on the firmer valley roads. As they traveled, Natalia noticed changes in the landscape: new fences, fresh-cut timber, survey stakes marking future railroad lines. Her family's influence was spreading like water through soil. That evening, they camped in a grove of cottonwoods. The spring air held more warmth here in the lowlands. After their meal, Samuel brought out his Bible, as he did each night. But instead of reading, he held it out to Natalia. "Would you?" he asked quietly. She took the familiar book, its leather soft with use. Opening to Psalms, she read, "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Samuel nodded slowly. Fitting words. "Mother used to say water rights were God's way of teaching us to be fair neighbors," Natalia replied, closing the Bible carefully. "You can't dam up justice without hurting those downstream." The third day dawned clear and cool. They set out early, knowing they'd reach town by dusk. Natalia felt tension building in her shoulders as familiar landmarks appeared: the old Miller's Road, the stand of lightning-struck pines, the distant church spire rising above the trees. "Remember," Samuel said as they approached the outskirts, "we stay at the Cooper's old place tonight. No one uses it this time of year." Natalia nodded. The Cooper's seasonal grazing cabin lay just beyond town limits, close enough for their purposes, far enough to avoid notice. They'd arranged permission through Mary's mother weeks ago. The sun was setting as they rolled past the first scattered buildings. Natalia pulled her shawl closer, though the evening wasn't cold. Strange to see these streets again, these familiar facades. Everything looked smaller somehow, less imposing than in her memories. They passed the church where she'd faced humiliation a year ago. Its windows were dark now, but she could almost hear the echoes of that Sunday morning. Her hands tightened on the portfolio in her lap, but her breathing remained steady. She was not that same woman anymore. The Cooper cabin was simple but sound, with space for the wagon under a lean-to. While Samuel tended to the horses, Natalia lit the cabin's single lamp and opened her portfolio once more. By its light, she wrote 2 notes in her clear, practiced hand. The first was to Mrs. Ortega. "Dear friend, your kindness is not forgotten. I would value your counsel tomorrow morning, if convenient. The bearer can be trusted with your reply." The second was more formal, addressed to Judge Albright. "Your Honor, I request a brief meeting regarding water rights and land claims in the Territorial Registry. The matter is both urgent and documented. Respectfully, Mrs. Natalia Boone." Samuel would deliver these before dawn, using the back streets he knew from his trading days. They had chosen their timing carefully. Monday morning, when Judge Albright held informal meetings, and Mrs. Ortega opened her shop early to receive deliveries. "Everything ready?" Samuel asked, coming in from the horses. "Yes." Natalia sealed the notes with her mother's old wax stamp. "Now we wait." They shared a simple supper, speaking little. The cabin creaked softly in the evening wind. Through its single window, Natalia could see the church spire black against the darkening sky. Tomorrow those bells would ring for morning service, just as they had that Sunday a year ago. But this time she would hear them differently, not as sounds of shame, but as a call to justice. Samuel banked the small fire for the night. "Try to rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow needs a clear head." Natalia nodded, but stayed by the window a while longer. Lights flickered in distant windows, the town preparing for sleep, unaware of what the morning would bring. She touched her mother's shawl, then the leather portfolio beneath it. Every document was in order, every fact confirmed, every claim supported by law and witness. The church bell tolled 9 o'clock, its deep notes rolling across the spring night. Natalia listened, her face calm in the lamplight. She had fled these bells once in despair. Now she returned bearing truth, wrapped in patience like a weapon. She turned from the window and prepared for sleep, knowing that when those bells rang for morning service, they would sound a different message, not of defeat, but of restoration, not of shame, but of justice. Through the cabin's thin walls came the sound of spring peepers singing in the creek bottom. Their chorus spoke of renewal, of winter's end, of changes that could not be held back. Natalia lay down beside her sleeping husband, her mind clear and focused on the task ahead. The portfolio rested within arm's reach, its contents organized and ready. When morning came, she would face her past with facts instead of fury, with evidence instead of accusations. The bells would ring, and she would answer their call, not as Natalia Hawthorne, the daughter they had tried to silence, but as Natalia Boone, who had learned that justice, like water, finds its own level in time. The courthouse stood silent in the early morning light, its wooden steps still wet with dew. Natalia climbed them steadily, her boots making soft sounds against the aged planks. The portfolio she carried felt heavier with each step, though its weight hadn't changed since yesterday. Samuel walked beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. They had risen before dawn, dressed with care, and walked the quiet streets while shop owners were just beginning to sweep their porches. Now, as the morning sun touched the courthouse windows, They waited on the bench outside Judge Albright's chambers. "First one's here," Samuel whispered, settling next to her. Natalia nodded, smoothing her skirts with one hand while the other remained firmly on the portfolio. Inside, organized with precision, lay months of careful work: land records, water rights, witness statements, and territory filings. Each document told part of a story that even she hadn't fully understood until recently. The courthouse clerk arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, keys jingling as he unlocked the heavy door. He barely glanced at them, assuming they were ordinary petitioners. Natalia waited until he had lit the lamps and settled at his desk before approaching. "Good morning," she said clearly. "I have documents to file with Judge Albright. My name is Mrs. Natalia Boone." The clerk looked up, reaching automatically for his ledger. "Nature of the filing? Water rights and property claims?" Natalia's voice remained steady. "Judge Albright is expecting me." As if summoned by his name, the judge appeared in his doorway. Henry Albright looked older than Natalia remembered, his hair grayer, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He studied her for a long moment before recognition flickered across his face. "Mrs. Boone," he said carefully, "please come in." Samuel squeezed her hand once before she followed the judge into his chambers. The room smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, just as it had when she'd visited with her mother years ago. Judge Albright settled behind his desk, gesturing to a chair. "Your note mentioned urgency," he said. "I trust you have documentation?" Natalia opened her portfolio. "Yes, Your Honor. Everything is here." For the next hour, she laid out documents one by one. Her mother's original water rights, filed when the territory was young. Land grants that had never been properly transferred. Witness statements from the reservation agency clerk. Recent survey maps showing the railroad's planned route directly through contested water access points. Judge Albright examined each paper methodically, occasionally making notes. He asked few questions, but those he did were precise. How had she obtained certain records? Could she verify specific dates? Were there living witnesses to key transactions? "These filings," he said finally, tapping a yellowed document, "appear to have remained valid despite recent changes in management." "Yes, Your Honor." Natalia kept her voice level. "My mother's original claims were never legally superseded." The judge steepled his fingers. "You understand this will require a formal hearing?" "I do." "There will be resistance." He studied her face. "Considerable resistance, I expect." Natalia met his gaze. "I understand, Your Honor. But water rights affect more than just my family now. The railroad's plans would cut off access to several small farms downstream." Judge Albright nodded slowly. He reached for his calendar, consulting it briefly. "I'll schedule a hearing for tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock. He looked up. "That gives all parties minimal time to prepare, but given the railroad's involvement, I agree this is urgent." "Thank you, Your Honor." As Natalia gathered her documents, the judge spoke again. "Mrs. Boone, welcome back to town." She paused at the door, touched by the gentle acknowledgement in his tone. "Thank you, sir. It's good to be back." Samuel was waiting exactly where she'd left him. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. They walked out together, passing the clerk who was already drafting hearing notices. By mid-morning, word had begun to spread through town. Natalia and Samuel noticed the whispers as they walked to Mrs. Ortega's shop. Heads turned, conversations paused, recognition dawned slowly on familiar faces. But Natalia kept walking, her steps sure and unhurried. Mrs. Ortega was waiting for them, her shop temporarily closed for a private meeting. She embraced Natalia fiercely. "Mi querida, you're alive! You're well!" "Thanks to you," Natalia said softly, remembering the help Mrs. Ortega had given during her escape. Your cousin saved my life that night." They shared a pot of strong coffee while Natalia explained tomorrow's hearing. Mrs. Ortega listened intently, occasionally nodding. "Your mother would be proud," she said finally. "She always said the truth would surface like a spring." Across town, in the Hawthorne Mercantile, the news arrived differently. Joshua burst into his father's office, waving a courthouse notice. "Some woman named Boone is challenging our water rights." Edgar Hawthorne barely looked up from his ledger. "Probably another nuisance claim. Have Robertson handle it. She's requesting a formal hearing. Tomorrow." Joshua paced the office. Judge Albright granted it personally. That caught Edgar's attention. He reached for the notice, scanning it quickly. "Boone, I don't know the name. Must be one of those mountain families getting desperate about the railroad." "Should we be worried?" Edgar waved dismissively. "We have every legal advantage. Let them waste the court's time." But Margaret Hawthorne, listening from the doorway, felt a chill of recognition. Something about the timing, the precision of the filing. She slipped away to her private parlor and pulled out her correspondence box. Carefully, she reviewed year-old letters, ones she'd intercepted, ones she'd written herself, building the case against Natalia. A name caught her eye. Samuel Boone, a widowed trapper who occasionally traded in town. She remembered him as quiet, competent, and completely uninterested in social games. The kind of man who might— "Oh, clever girl," Margaret whispered. She closed the box slowly, her mind racing. Very clever indeed. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation and whispered conversations. Natalia and Samuel stayed mostly at Mrs. Ortega's, reviewing documents one final time. Occasionally, they caught glimpses of familiar faces through the shop windows. Former friends, neighbors, people who had turned away that Sunday morning a year ago. As evening approached, Judge Albright's clerk posted the official hearing notice on the courthouse door. 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. The matter of Boone versus Hawthorne regarding water rights and land claims. All interested parties to attend. A small crowd gathered to read it, murmuring amongst themselves. Some recognized the connection immediately. Others would learn it soon enough. By nightfall, the news had reached every corner of town. Natalia Hawthorne had returned, wearing a new name, but carrying old truths. In the Hawthorne house, Margaret finally shared her suspicions with Edgar and Joshua. "It's her," she said firmly. "She's married that mountain trader and found some legal angle to attack us." Joshua scoffed. "She has no standing. We made sure of that." "The judge granted a hearing," Margaret reminded him. "Henry Albright doesn't waste time on frivolous claims." Edgar sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older. "What does she want?" "Justice, I expect." Margaret's voice was dry. "Or revenge, perhaps both." They argued late into the night, but could reach no consensus on how to proceed. Joshua wanted to challenge her identity. Edgar suggested financial compromise. Margaret counseled caution until they knew exactly what evidence Natalia had gathered. Meanwhile, in the Cooper cabin, Natalia and Samuel prepared for sleep. The portfolio lay ready for tomorrow, its contents organized and clear. Through the window, they could see the courthouse silvered by moonlight. "Are you ready?" Samuel asked softly. Natalia touched her mother's shawl, draped carefully over a chair. "Yes," she said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, the truth will have its day in court." The night settled around them, stars wheeling overhead. In town, lights winked out one by one as people went to bed discussing tomorrow's hearing. Some remembered Natalia's humiliation, wondering if justice would look different in the clear light of law. Others worried about their own water access, hoping for protection from railroad interests. Judge Albright worked late in his chambers, reviewing territorial statutes and water rights precedents. His clerk had already prepared the hearing room, setting out extra chairs for what promised to be a full house. At 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, the truth would indeed have its day. But for now, the town slept, and the spring wind whispered through empty streets, carrying the scent of coming change. The courthouse filled early that afternoon. Townspeople squeezed into wooden benches, their Sunday best rustling as they shifted and whispered. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through tall windows. The air felt thick with anticipation. Natalia sat beside Samuel at the plaintiff's table, her mother's blue shawl draped across her shoulders. The familiar weight of her evidence portfolio rested before her. She had arranged every document in precise order, each one a piece of truth waiting to be revealed. The back door opened. Edgar, Margaret, and Joshua Hawthorne entered together, taking their places at the defendant's table. Joshua's face darkened when he saw Natalia, but she kept her eyes forward, focused on the empty judge's bench. At precisely 2 o'clock, the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Henry Albright presiding." Judge Albright entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. He settled into his chair, surveying the packed room with weathered eyes. "Be seated." The scrape of boots and shuffle of skirts filled the air. "We are here today regarding the matter of Boone versus Hawthorne, concerning water rights and associated land claims." He turned to Natalia. "Mrs. Boone, you may present your case." Natalia rose slowly, her hands steady as she opened her portfolio. "Your Honor, I will demonstrate that the original water rights filed by Sarah Hawthorne, my mother, remain legally valid. These rights were never properly transferred or superseded." She began laying out documents on the evidence table. "I will also show that recent attempts to sell these water rights to the railroad would cause material harm to multiple downstream properties." For the next hour, Natalia methodically presented her evidence. She showed the original territorial filings, each one properly stamped and witnessed. Maps illustrated how the water access points connected to various properties. Letters and ledgers documented her mother's careful management of these resources. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and controlled, "I would like to call my first witness." Mrs. Ortega approached the stand, her gray hair neat beneath her best bonnet. She testified about Sarah Hawthorne's business practices, about watching Natalia learn bookkeeping at her mother's knee, about the careful way water access had been shared among neighbors. "And did you witness any signs of mental instability in Mrs. Boone, then Miss Hawthorne, before her sudden departure last year?" "Never." Mrs. Ortega's voice carried firm conviction. She was always sensible, always fair in her dealings. The reservation agency clerk testified next, confirming the validity of the original water rights. "These claims were never legally transferred or amended," he stated, pointing to specific entries in the territorial records. "They remain active under the original filing." Throughout the testimony, Joshua shifted restlessly in his chair. When his turn for cross-examination came, he stood abruptly, looming over the witness stand. "Isn't it true that frontier records are often incomplete, missing, convenient for anyone wanting to make false claims?" "Objection," Samuel called out, rising. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Albright said firmly. "Mr. Hawthorne, confine yourself to specific questions about the evidence presented." Joshua's face flushed dark red. He turned toward Natalia, his voice rising. "This is nothing but a spiteful attempt to—" "Mr. Hawthorne." The judge's tone cut through the air like a blade. "Control yourself, or you will be removed from this courtroom." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Joshua sat down hard, his jaw clenched. Margaret touched his arm in warning, but he shrugged her off. Natalia continued calling witnesses, 3 neighboring farmers testified about their dependence on the water access points in question. A former clerk from the Mercantile confirmed Natalia's competence in managing the books. Each testimony built upon the others, creating a clear picture of truth. Then Reverend Miles approached the stand. He looked older than Natalia remembered, his shoulders bent as if carrying a heavy weight. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. "Reverend," Natalia began gently, "please tell the court about the Sunday morning when my father and stepmother interrupted your service." The preacher's hands twisted together. "They came in during the final hymn, said they had an announcement about your mental state." He swallowed hard. "They asked me to support their statement about your need for supervision." "Did you have any prior evidence of such concerns?" "No." His voice cracked. "No, I did not." "Yet you allowed their accusations to stand. Why?" Reverend Miles looked down at his hands. "I was afraid," he whispered. "Afraid of losing my position, my pulpit. The Hawthorns are powerful people." He raised his eyes to meet Natalia's. "I knew it was wrong. I've carried that shame every day since. I ask your forgiveness, and God's." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Natalia nodded once, accepting his words without comment. "No further questions, Your Honor." Joshua leapt up again. "This is theater, nothing more." She abandoned her responsibilities, ran away like a guilty. "Mr. Hawthorne!" Judge Albright's gavel crashed down. "One more outburst and you will be held in contempt. Is that clear?" Joshua subsided, but his eyes blazed with fury. Margaret whispered something urgently to Edgar, who shook his head. Natalia presented her final evidence, the railroad survey maps showing planned construction through the disputed water access points. "Your Honor, if these rights are sold, multiple families will lose their water access. The damage would be irreversible." Judge Albright studied the maps carefully. He looked up at the crowded courtroom, then back to his notes. The afternoon light had softened to amber, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. "I have heard sufficient testimony to warrant a full review of all claims and documents presented today." His voice filled the hushed room. "Until this review is complete, I am issuing an immediate stay on all transactions involving the disputed properties and water rights. No sales, no transfers, no alterations to current access arrangements will be permitted." He turned to face the Hawthorns directly. "Furthermore, all associated assets are hereby frozen pending full investigation. This includes the mercantile accounts and any attempted railroad negotiations." Joshua half rose, but Edgar pulled him back down. Margaret's face had gone pale. "Mrs. Boone has presented compelling evidence of both her competence and her legal standing regarding these claims. This court will reconvene in 1 week to begin detailed review of all documents." Judge Albright lifted his gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." The crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. For a moment, perfect silence held. Then the room erupted in whispers and movement as people began to stand. Natalia remained seated, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Samuel's warm presence beside her anchored her as the reality of what had just happened settled over the room. Truth had finally broken through the surface, like a spring pushing up through rocky ground. The Hawthorns swept out first, Joshua's angry stride carrying him ahead of his father and stepmother. Townspeople filed out more slowly, many pausing to nod respectfully to Natalia or touch her shoulder in passing. Judge Albright gathered his papers unhurriedly. Before leaving the bench, he looked directly at Natalia. The smallest smile touched his lips, not of triumph, but of justice properly served. Then he too departed, his robes whispering against the floorboards. The late afternoon sun slanted golden through the windows, touching the empty witness stand, The scattered papers, the worn wooden rails. Natalia finally stood, gathering her documents with careful hands. "Ready?" Samuel asked softly. She looked around the courtroom one last time, remembering that Sunday morning that had changed everything. But now truth had been spoken in this same public space, heard and acknowledged under the law. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." They walked out together into the long shadows of evening, leaving the empty courtroom behind. The gavel's echo still seemed to hang in the air, the sound of truth breaking through at last. The morning sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as people filed in for the second day of proceedings. Natalia sat straight-backed beside Samuel, her documentation arranged neatly before her. The Hawthorns entered as a group, Joshua's face tight with anger, Edgar looking drawn and pale, Margaret maintaining her usual composed facade. Judge Albright called the court to order, his gavel sharp in the morning quiet. "Before we proceed with additional testimony, I have some concerning findings to address." He lifted a stack of papers. "Last evening, my clerk and I conducted a preliminary review of the documents submitted yesterday. We discovered irregularities that require immediate attention." The judge gestured to his clerk, who approached with an evidence box. "Would you please display Exhibits A through D on the evidence table?" The clerk carefully arranged several ledgers and correspondence files. Natalia recognized them as copies of records she had gathered over the past year. "Mrs. Boone, would you approach and identify these documents?" Natalia walked forward, her steps measured on the wooden floor. "Yes, Your Honor. These are mercantile records from March through June of last year, along with correspondence regarding water rights filed during that period." "And these additional papers?" The judge indicated a second set of documents. "Those appear to be the versions currently held in the mercantile office, Your Honor." Judge Albright nodded. "Indeed. When compared side by side, there are significant discrepancies between these two sets of records. Specifically, there is evidence of systematic alteration in the office copies." He turned to face the Hawthorns. "Mr. Joshua Hawthorne, please approach the bench." Joshua rose slowly, his usual swagger diminished. As he stood before the judge, Albright held up 2 pages. "Can you explain why the dates and amounts in these ledger entries have been clearly modified? The paper shows signs of erasure and rewriting." "Business records often require adjustment, Your Honor," Joshua said stiffly. "Nothing improper about correcting errors." "Except these aren't corrections, Mr. Hawthorne. They're deliberate alterations designed to obscure the timing of certain transactions." The judge's voice hardened. "Furthermore, we've found evidence that multiple pieces of correspondence were intercepted and destroyed, letters that would have supported Mrs. Boone's competency and legal standing." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Joshua's face flushed dark red. "You can't prove—" "Actually, we can." Judge Albright gestured to his clerk again. "We have sworn statements from 3 postal workers regarding unusual instructions they received about holding back certain mail. Would you like to explain those instructions, Mr. Hawthorne?" Joshua's hands clenched at his sides. "I don't have to explain anything. This is a witch hunt, nothing more." "Mr. Edgar Hawthorne," the judge called, "please approach." Edgar rose unsteadily, his usual dignity crumbling as he faced the bench. "Your Honor?" "Were you aware of these document alterations, Mr. Hawthorne?" Edgar's shoulders slumped. He glanced at Joshua, then at Margaret before turning back to the judge. I suspected, but I didn't want to know for certain." "Father!" Joshua's voice cracked like a whip. But something had broken in Edgar Hawthorne. The words began spilling out, his voice trembling. "I told myself it was for her own good, that she needed protection from herself. But I knew she was never unstable. He turned toward Natalia, his face lined with shame. I knew you were just like your mother, careful, competent, fair-minded, but I was afraid. Afraid of what? Judge Albright pressed. Afraid of losing control, afraid of change. Margaret said. He stopped, swallowing hard. Margaret stood abruptly, her skirts rustling. I won't listen to this nonsense. Her voice cut through the air like ice. If you insist on humiliating yourself, Edgar, you'll do it without me. She turned and swept toward the door, her steps sharp on the wooden floor. Mrs. Hawthorne, Judge Albright called, this court has not dismissed you. She paused at the doorway, her back rigid. I dismiss myself, Your Honor. I see no need to witness this spectacle. The door closed firmly behind her. Edgar seemed to deflate further. She convinced me Natalia was too young, too naive to handle the business properly. Said we needed to take control before she made serious mistakes. But there were never any mistakes, were there? He looked at his daughter, his eyes wet. You were managing everything exactly as your mother taught you. Yes, Natalia said softly. I was. Joshua made a disgusted sound. This is pathetic. You're going to let them destroy everything we've built, all our plans for expansion? Your plans, Joshua, Edgar said wearily. Your schemes. I should have seen what you were becoming. Judge Albright's gavel cracked through the tension. Having reviewed all evidence presented, including these newly documented irregularities, I am prepared to make my ruling. He straightened in his chair, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. First, I find no evidence whatsoever supporting the claims of mental instability used to seize control of Mrs. Boone's assets. Those claims are hereby dismissed as fraudulent. He lifted another document. Second, the water rights and land claims in question are legally registered to Sarah Hawthorne and her direct heirs. No valid transfer of these rights has ever been recorded. Therefore, they belong rightfully to her daughter, Natalia Hawthorne Boone. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd at the name. People began turning to look more closely at Natalia, recognition dawning on their faces. Third, the judge continued, given the evidence of document tampering and deliberate fraud, I am ordering a full audit of all mercantile records and transactions from the past year. Mr. Joshua Hawthorne will present himself to the sheriff's office by sunset today to answer charges of fraud and interference with postal delivery. Joshua's face went from red to white. You can't. I can, and I have. Judge Albright's voice was steel. Be grateful I'm not ordering your immediate arrest from this courtroom. He shuffled his papers decisively. All properties and assets previously held by Natalia Hawthorne are hereby restored to her full control, with her husband Samuel Boone as co-signatory if she so chooses. The temporary guardianship is dissolved. This ruling is effective immediately. The gavel fell with finality. As people began rising from their seats, the whispers grew louder. Natalia heard her name repeated, saw the moments of realization as townspeople connected the confident young woman before them with the girl they'd watched being humiliated in the church that Sunday morning. Mrs. Ortega pushed through the crowd to embrace her. Child, why didn't you tell me who you were when you first came back? I needed the truth to speak for itself, Natalia said quietly. Not my name, not old loyalties, just facts and evidence. Others were gathering around now. Shopkeepers, neighbors, church members. Many looked ashamed as they remembered their silence during her public accusation. But there was respect in their faces, too, and something like awe at how thoroughly she had proved her case through patience and careful documentation rather than dramatic confrontation. Reverend Miles approached hesitantly. Mrs. Boone, Miss Natalia, I want to again express my deep regret. She touched his arm gently. What's done is done, Reverend. Truth has prevailed. That's what matters now. Samuel stood beside her, his solid presence a reminder of everything she had gained along this difficult path. She saw Joshua storm out, his fury evident in every line of his body. Edgar remained in his seat, looking lost and old. The courtroom slowly emptied around them. Judge Albright approached as his clerk gathered the evidence files. "Well done, Mrs. Boone. Your mother would have been proud of how you handled this." "Thank you, Your Honor." Natalia glanced at the scattered papers being carefully repacked. "Truth leaves a trail if we're patient enough to follow it." "Indeed it does." He nodded to them both and moved away. The morning sun had climbed higher, pouring golden light through the windows. Natalia gathered her documents, tucking them into her leather satchel. All around her she could hear people talking, finally piecing together the full story of her disappearance and return. But she had no need to explain or defend herself now. The evidence had spoken. Justice had been served. Her identity had been revealed not through confrontation or dramatic declaration, but through the patient presentation of truth. Samuel touched her elbow. "Ready to go home?" She looked up at him, grateful once again for his steadfast support through all of this. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." They walked together through the courthouse doors into the bright morning, leaving behind the whispers and stares. Natalia had reclaimed not just her property and good name, but something even more precious, the power of truth to overcome deception, and the strength to stand firmly in that truth, no matter how long it took to prevail. The morning breeze carried the scent of spring flowers and fresh possibilities. Natalia breathed it in deeply, feeling the weight of the past year finally lifting from her shoulders. She had won her victory not through drama or vengeance, but through careful documentation and unwavering patience. Just as Samuel had said, justice, like planting, required time and faith to bear fruit. As news spread through town, reactions rippled like waves on a pond. By noon, the sheriff and 2 deputies had taken control of the mercantile's books. They carried out stacks of ledgers while townspeople watched from the boardwalk. Mrs. Ortega stood beside Natalia, her hand steady on the younger woman's arm. "Look at all those red-marked pages," Mrs. Ortega whispered. "Joshua never was one for honest arithmetic." Natalia kept her expression neutral. "The numbers will speak for themselves now." Around 2 o'clock, Joshua's shouts echoed down Main Street as the sheriff led him from the bank in handcuffs. His face was mottled red, his neat collar askew. "This is persecution," he yelled. "You're all going to regret this." But the watching crowd remained silent. No one stepped forward to defend him. The sheriff's wagon rattled away toward the county jail, leaving only dust and whispers behind. Near sunset, Edgar Hawthorne emerged from the mercantile. He looked aged, shoulders bent under his good wool coat. Standing on the steps, he cleared his throat. "I wish to announce my immediate resignation from all business dealings in this town." His voice quavered. "I have failed in my duties, to my family, to this community, and to truth itself. I ask forgiveness, though I deserve none." He turned to go, but Natalia stepped forward. "Father," she called softly, "will you walk with me?" They moved slowly down the street together, past curious onlookers, until they reached the small garden behind the church. The setting sun painted the roses gold. Edgar sank onto a wooden bench. "I don't know how to make this right," he whispered. Natalia sat beside him. "You can't undo what's done, but you can choose a better path forward." "After what I allowed to happen to you, the lies I helped spread?" He shook his head. "How can you even look at me?" "Because holding on to bitterness would only poison my own heart." Natalia touched his hand gently. "I forgive you, Father. Not because you deserve it, but because I choose to release that burden." Tears rolled down Edgar's weathered cheeks. "You truly are your mother's daughter." "The business arrangements will stand as the judge ordered," Natalia said firmly, "but you'll always be my father." "That hasn't changed." After Edgar left, Natalia entered the empty church. Light streamed through the western windows, turning the wooden pews to burnished copper. She knelt in the same spot where, months ago, her family had tried to break her spirit. "Lord," she prayed softly, "thank you for carrying me through this valley. Thank you for Samuel's strength, for friends who stood by truth, for the patience to wait for justice." She paused, touching her mother's worn Bible. "And thank you for helping me choose mercy over vengeance. Let healing begin here, in this place of both wounds and grace." The church was silent except for the whisper of an evening breeze through the open windows. Natalia remained kneeling, at peace with both justice and mercy, knowing that truth had prevailed without requiring cruelty to triumph. 3 weeks after the court ruling, Natalia sat at her mother's old desk in the mercantile office, reviewing the final stack of legal documents. Sunlight streamed through freshly cleaned windows, catching dust motes that danced above the papers. Each signature represented another piece of restored order. "These water rights agreements look proper," Samuel said from his chair by the door. His presence, steady and warm like a hearth fire, had become familiar to the townspeople who came seeking resolution. Natalia nodded, dipping her pen in ink. "With these protections in place, both the Henderson family and the Northern Ute settlement can access the creek year-round." She signed her name with careful strokes. "No one should have to beg for water that God provided freely." Through the window she watched children playing in the street, settler and native alike. Their laughter carried clearly, untouched by the divisions their parents had known. It was for them, she thought, that the work truly mattered. Later that afternoon, Natalia walked with Reverend Miles along the edge of town, where fresh stakes marked the boundaries of newly donated land. The minister paused, running his hand along one of the wooden markers. "A whole acre for the school, and another for a proper church building," he said quietly. "Your mother would be proud of this choice. She always said education and faith were gifts meant for sharing." Natalia smiled, remembering her mother's voice. "The old church building served well, but the town is growing. We need room for all who wish to come." That evening, Samuel and Natalia hosted a gathering at the mercantile. Mrs. Ortega brought fresh bread. The Hendersons arrived with preserves. 2 Northern Ute families whom Samuel had known for years brought dried berries and shared stories that made the children laugh, the sound of multiple languages mixed with the clinking of coffee cups. "Feels different now," Samuel murmured as they watched their guests. "Like spring after a hard winter." Natalia squeezed his hand. "Because people can breathe again. There's no more fear about water rights or land claims." She paused, watching Mrs. Henderson chat easily with one of the Ute women about garden planting. When justice comes with kindness, healing follows naturally. Over the next days, wagons brought lumber for the new school. Volunteers gathered to clear the land. Natalia worked alongside them, her sleeves rolled up, while Samuel helped direct the heavy lifting. The town's rhythm had changed. Neighbors greeted each other more warmly, shared tools more freely. In the mercantile ledgers, Natalia created new sections, one for community needs, another for emergency assistance. She remembered too well how it felt to stand alone. No one in her town would face that again, not if she could help it. "Your system of managing things," Samuel said one evening as she explained her plans. "It's more than just business now. It's about holding folks together." "That's what Mother understood," Natalia replied, touching the worn cover of her mother's Bible. True restoration isn't just about property. It's about healing the bonds between people. Through the open door, they could hear the sound of hammers from the school site, the murmur of different languages, children's laughter. The town was finding its way forward, one small kindness at a time. Late summer sun painted the town golden as Natalia locked the mercantile's door one final time. The brass key felt warm in her palm as she handed it to Mrs. Ortega, who would oversee operations in her absence. "You've done good here," Mrs. Ortega said, her dark eyes bright with emotion. "But the mountains are calling you both home." Samuel stood by their loaded wagon, checking the harnesses one last time. Their life together had started in those high places, and now they would return there, where peace lived in the whisper of pine trees and clean mountain air. Judge Albright approached, his boots stirring dust in the morning light. "The final papers are registered," he said, holding out a leather folder. "Everything's in proper order, Mrs. Boone." Natalia took the folder, running her fingers over her married name embossed on its surface. "Thank you, Judge, for everything." "You could stay," Mrs. Ortega said softly. "The town would welcome you as its leader now." Natalia shook her head, smiling. "Power wasn't what I came back for. The truth is restored, the water rights are protected, and the new school will open soon. That's enough." Samuel helped her onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. The reins felt right in his strong hands. Around them, townspeople paused their morning routines to wave farewell. "The mountains are prettier than boardrooms anyway," Samuel said quietly, a gentle understanding in his voice. Natalia squared her shoulders, proud of the name she'd earned and the peace she'd chosen. As they rode towards the foothills, she watched the town grow smaller behind them. The morning sun caught the new church steeple, making it shine like a beacon of hope. The wagon wheels turned steadily northward, each rotation carrying them closer to home. Ahead, the mountains rose blue and eternal against the sky, promising the simple life they both cherished. Golden lamplight danced across the cabin's worn table as Natalia set out 2 tin plates for supper. The familiar scent of fresh-baked bread and venison stew filled the air, mingling with pine smoke from the hearth. Through the window, she could see the last rays of sunset painting the mountains purple. Her fingers traced the edge of her mother's old ledger as she settled into her chair. Samuel's steady presence across the table brought a deep sense of peace. Here, in this place where she'd first found refuge, everything felt right. "A year ago, they tried to erase me," she said softly, stirring her stew. "Not just my name in the books, but who I was." Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And now? Now I'm restored, not just to property or position, but to myself." Natalia smiled, watching the lamplight catch the gold of her wedding band. The truth couldn't stay buried. Samuel reached for the worn Bible beside his plate, its leather cover smooth from years of handling. Opening to the book of Psalms, he began to read in his deep, gentle voice. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Outside, the creek that had welcomed her that first desperate night burbled steadily, its water rights now protected for generations to come. The sound merged with Samuel's reading, a reminder of God's provision. Natalia's hand rested on the ledger one final time before closing it. All accounts were settled, all wrongs made right. But the greatest victory wasn't in the courthouse or the restored deeds. It was here, in this quiet moment, in this sacred space where faith and love had given her something far stronger than revenge. Justice was complete, but peace would endure. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.